Hope everyone is doing well. I know it's a sad time. We're at going into the 9 days, and hopefully, as they say, they will change. Miyagon l'simcha should come from sadness to happiness, and we hope that's the case. Again, our topic is inspiration through halacha, and I wanted to talk about a halacha, a topic that is especially common now, and actually share with you. I don't have some of the text. I don't have, but I'll talk to you a little bit about some of these discussions, and I want to preface with the fact that this is not meant to be a psak, but just an interesting analysis of a topic having to do with people who are some of the reasons, but people who are ill and or have some other restriction regarding fasting. And the interesting question that we'll start with, and we'll get back to at the end, and hopefully tie it all together in a sort of a values-based discussion, which is when you are ill, you absolutely, of course, don't fast. Tisha B'Av's coming up. It's a day of seriousness, etc. But obviously, we take preservation of health and life first. But the question is the following: once you're eating on Tisha B'Av, should you do something in your meal that commemorates the fact that it's Tisha B'Av? So, for example, if we think of a parallel here, on a Rosh Hashanah, on a Sukkot, right? We don't just eat. We eat, and we eat a special, and as we eat in a special way. Eating is not simply an act that we do to nourish ourselves, but it's a momentous occasion that we build spiritual experiences around meals. That's just what we do, right? Not just the funny joke of that they killed us, we won, let's eat. But it's really a concept, a notion where we try to make our meals a spiritual experience. So that, for example, on a Yom Tov, we don't just have a meal, but we start it with a ceremony of Kiddush, right? It's a ceremonial spiritual event. We end it, well, not just with the regular blessing, but we add enhancements to that blessing because of the nature. This is just eating. This is an eating that is meaningful today. So here's the question. If one is eating on Tisha B'Av, should you make some sort of mention about Tisha B'Av in your meal? And I'll give you the specific possibility example, which is that in Shmona Esrei, in the davening, we add a special prayer called Nachem. Nachem is a request that God give us consolation due to the destruction of Jerusalem. We ask Hashem for consolation, and as we ask God to console us, we say Baruch Atah Hashem, right? Bonei Tzion, Menachem Tzion, Bonei Yerushalayim, and we actually insert it into the bracha about Yerushalayim, the rebuilding of Jerusalem that we yearn for. When we yearn for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, we also add this extra paragraph about Tisha B'Av. So maybe in benching, where there is also a prayer for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, known as Uvenei Yerushalayim. We're praying for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Should we add a special addition of Nachem and a special addition of a request and a hope that God console us during the prayer of grace after meals, of after we eaten? Or you could make the argument, which is that the entire concept of eating is anathema to today. You have to eat because absolutely you have to eat, not a question. You have to eat to make sure you keep your health. However, to speak about the fact that today is a fast day, or today is a day of mourning over Jerusalem, in the prayer that you're talking about eating, that seems to be sort of a non sequitur. It doesn't fit together. So this is a discussion that's raised. When one is required to eat on a fast day, and you would, let's say you have bread, and you would make a motzi, and you would do Birkat Hamazon, which is its own discussion, but we'll assume you do that. Should you insert a commemoration of the destruction of Jerusalem, which is really commemorated on this day? So that's the question I wanted to deal with, but using that prism of that question, try and develop a greater idea and understanding about the concept of Tisha B'Av and what we're praying about. Okay, so again, if there's any questions or any thoughts about what you think the answer to this could be, should you add Nachem? Should you add an addition to the prayer of Jerusalem? To the Birkat Hamazon. That's what we're going to deal with. And if you have any thoughts, feel free to unmute and share your thoughts. But what I want to try and do is see if there are any parallels to this. Do we have any parallels to this question anywhere else in the halacha? And the first thing that many of the commentaries do is what they do is they look at other situations where you might come up. And the first thing they look at is there's another fast day that we're familiar with. It's Yom Kippur. And there the question is even perhaps more stark, because Yom Kippur is a day in which we fast, but it's also a Yom Tov. So the first question that's dealt with is in the Torah. And the Torah suggests, let me see if I have that here, in Simon Taf Reish Yud Chet. I don't have it here. Let me plug it in. Hopefully you see the screen share. I'll bring in the Torah over here. The Torah says the following. Choleh she'achal b'Yom Kippurim. If someone is ill and they ate on Yom Kippur, which absolutely they were supposed to, no question, nobody's asking about whether they should eat or not. V'ni yashev da'ato, b'inyan she'chol v'rech, and they had, sufficiently gained their composure. I guess they were sick and they lost their composure because of hunger, and they sufficiently regained it so they could make a bracha. Haya omer Adoni Avi Harash, he quotes his father, saying, Tzarich lehazkir shel Yom Kippurim bebirkat hamazon. Sheomer yalev yavo b'bonei Yerushalayim. So this approach says the following, really interesting suggestion, that what you're supposed to do on Yom Kippur is have a meal and say Ya'alev Yavo. Meaning, when you make the blessing on that meal, you actually should mention, today is Yom Kippur, and I'm eating my meal in honor of Yom Kippur. And this is listen to the Hagos Maimoni, which is again one of the commentaries on the Rambam. Hagos Maimoni says right here, "V'cholesh yesh bo sakana," somebody who's ill, she'ochel b'Yom Kippurim, they eat on Yom Kippur. Omer me'ein hamorah birkat hamazon. He mentions Yom Kippur when he does the blessing of the grace after meals. V'davar pashudu, it's obvious that you should do this. Debehetera ka'achil, that you are eating in a permitted fashion. V'adarabba, and even more so, mitzvah ka'avid. You are fulfilling a mitzvah by eating today on Yom Kippur. Tehave lididei Yom Kippurim kish'ar Yom Tov. And for this person, Yom Kippur is like any other holiday. And interestingly, the commentaries who quote this, Hagos Maimoni, say, do you know what you should do? If you need to eat on Yom Kippur, you should set a beautiful table, have, gorgeous Kiddush goblet and 2 loaves of bread. Have the meal the same way you would have had it on a regular Yom Tov, like a Shabbat or a Rosh Hashanah or a Sukkot, and you should make Kiddush. And not only that, you should recite benching and recite Ya'alev Yavo, recite the special prayer in benching. Because the way the Hagos Maimoni suggests is because you are doing a mitzvah by eating. Now, this is a very, very powerful concept, which is being suggested here. It really takes a somewhat of a controversial view, but it takes a page out of the concept of the power of pikuach nefesh, the power of making sure we safeguard our health, where it says, and this is something very, very interesting. There's two ways we could see somebody who has to eat on a fast day, on Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av or whatever it may be. You could see this person as someone in need of Rahmanis, so to speak, someone who, terrible, nebuch, it's so awful, they have to eat, and somehow their observance of Yom Kippur is considered lesser. Their observances of Tisha B'Av is considered a lower level of less value. Or you could say that for this person who has this medical issue, who has this requirement to eat or drink, their Yom Kippur is transformed. It's a different kind of day. For everybody else, Yom Kippur means sitting in shul and not eating and not drinking and following exactly what the rules the Torah said, you follow all those rules. For this person, Yom Kippur is different. Yom Kippur is a day that has eating and drinking because they need it for their health. But this is not something about which they should feel guilty, about which they should be saying that they are having a lower level or less of an observance of Yom Kippur. No. Once it's established, again, obviously you have to establish it, but once it's established that this person must eat for health reasons, then their Yom Kippur is no less valuable or valid than anyone else's. So much so, again, the commentary is using the Nagas Maimon, and he says, this is your Yom Tov. This is your, right? The same way we wear beautiful clothing on Yom Kippur, we, dress up in our finest. So too, we have a festive meal. The only problem is you can't have a festive meal because the Torah tells you to fast. But this person who's ill, the Torah didn't tell to fast. And therefore, they actually treat their observance of Yom Kippur like a lichatchila, like a way that they're supposed to be doing it. And the analysis of this is that the Nagas Maimon, the Rosh and the Torah, understand that Yom Kippur is essentially a multi-layered holiday. It's a Yom Tov with a fast grafted on top of it. Well, for this person, you take away the fast. What are you left with? You're left like any other Yom Tov. And what do you do on a Yom Tov? You have a festive meal. You make a benching. You day Kiddush. You do Ya'alev Yavo. You do all those things. And so the suggestion that's being made here is that that's the way you should observe Yom Kippur and approach your observance of Yom Kippur. What's interesting is that there's actually a different approach. The Shibbolei Leket has a different approach, but I just wanted to have that sink in because I think it's a very powerful idea. The concept that the Torah gives, especially when it comes to Pikuach Nefesh, is that when you take, I don't use the word taking advantage of, a leniency, but the point is when you follow the mandates of making sure you safeguard your health, you are seen as having a true Yom Tov, and you're meant to have that experience and approach it that way, not approach it out of a sense of despair or a sense of guilt. So I think that's a very, very powerful idea. Now, interestingly, when it comes to Yom Kippur, one of the other commentaries in Italian, Rishon, known as the Shibbolei Leket, disagrees. Let me just see here, and says the following. It says, Chola sha'ala sha'achal b'Yom Kippurim, a sick person who eats on Yom Kippur, im tzarich la'azkir me'enu mora b'berkat hamazon, should they have a special mention of Yom Kippur when they do benching? V'yeshiv li b'ktav glilei yadav, and he wrote a manuscript, nired tekevan dalav mitzvah klal b'achilo mechamat hayom, ki adrabah hayom gorom lo isur achila ulakol Yisrael. Says the only time you make a special ceremony out of your meal is if the day causes that meal, right? You're having the meal because it's a special day. You're having the meal of Rosh Hashanah because it's a special day, and that's why you're having the apple and honey. You're having all this stuff. You're having the meal in Sukkot because it's a special day. So then you should mention it's Sukkot. But Yom Kippur is not telling you to eat. In fact, Yom Kippur, The concept of Yom Kippur says you shouldn't be eating. You are ill, so of course you should eat. But he says, "Umishabe lekachol legabe linyan achila." Mistaber to lotikun rabbanan letikun le rabbanan hazkara. So the Shibur Leleket actually takes a different tack, and he says that what happens is, for this person, Yom Kippur is essentially erased. And what he says is, it's not like Yom Kippur is an onion, where you have a holiday and then grafted on top of it as a fast. You pull away the fast, you're just left with a holiday, and you make the meal and the holiday experience accordingly. Shibur Leleket's understanding is that no, that this is a day that essentially is canceled for you. But interestingly, he said he agrees with the basic premise that this is the person who should eat. It just says don't call it Yom Kippur. And for when you're eating, you don't have to deal with Yom Kippur is not the cause of your meal. The cause of your meal is the fact that you need to make sure you take care of your health. But again, he doesn't argue on that basic concept of the idea of how serious we have to be about taking care of our health. And it says, "Mistaber b'Yom Kippurim ha'asur ba'achila lo tikun rabbanan hazkara afilu lechatchila mishahuta lo lechol kevin shel ein hayom gorim lo." The day Yom Kippur is not causing you to eat. Hilkach hasvar b'adat notena ki lo tiknu chachamim l'choleh b'Yom Kippurim lo kiddush al hakos lo hazkara b'birkat hamazon v'hu hadin b'tisha b'av. So he suggests here that also on Tisha B'Av, you should not have any recognition of the day because this is not a day that is one that should engender a meal. This is a day that says, you should fast. And if because of some illness you can't fast, okay, so don't fast. But it's not a day that you should, in your commemoration of in your Birkat Hamazon, in your blessing, you shouldn't do this, recognition. Do this holiday. Do a recognition of the day like Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur in your benching. Okay. So to try and understand this, I want to share with you a story that happened to a colleague of mine, who back in the day when there was ubiquitous summer camps, they were having a summer camp in the Catskill Mountains. And this was a camp with a strong Jewish identity. It was an Orthodox camp. And so one of the things they worked really hard to do was to create the Tisha B'Av ambiance, right? Because Tisha B'Av usually happens during that summer season, the summer camp season. They really wanted to create a Tisha B'Av ambiance. So what did they do? They dimmed all the lights. They took away all the chairs. They piped in somber a cappella music, people humming and They really did whatever they could to create that aura, that as they say in Hebrew, avira, of Tisha B'Av. And they get to Eicha, they get to the climax of the day, and they have some candles in a darkened room, and everybody's sitting on the floor, and they're going to go read the sad book of Lamentations. And what happens? They all sit down to start the ceremony of Eicha, and they hear in the background disco music. Disco music, loud as could be in the background. Loud disco music in the background. So imagine what that does to the aura of Tisha B'Av. You're trying to sit down and have a sad time and having candles and a darkened room and everybody's down. And suddenly you hear, talk about a non sequitur, something that is not consonant with what you're talking about. They hear this disco music. Now it happened to be that there was a different camp a couple miles down the road. And they, at some point went to this other camp and they said, well, what's going on? Why are you Dafka right now? You have to play disco music? And listen to what the answer was. The answer was, yes, this is our annual Tisha B'Av disco. Our annual Tisha B'Av disco. What was the background? They said the following. They said Tisha B'Av is a commemoration of a building that was destroyed millennia ago, thousands of years ago. And it was a time that Jewish people lost sovereignty. They lost self-determination. They sort of went on a spiral of death and destruction over their history. But now we have self-determination. We have freedoms. We have capability of freedom of worship. We even have access to Jerusalem. So there's no reason to be sad anymore. And so that's why every year we have our Tisha B'Av disco. Now, you could think that definitely ruined the mood in my colleagues' camp about the Tisha B'Av disco. But why are they wrong? Or are they? The people who want to celebrate on Tisha B'Av, what exactly is the background there? What's wrong with what they're doing? So, again, I would argue that there is a fundamental problem with ignoring the tragedies of Jewish history, even if you feel currently that those tragedies have subsided. Because, first of all, it's a disrespect to all those who lost terrible things during that time period, where you're just not, paying heed. But you're also making, I would say, a fairly arrogant statement that we are where we want to be, spiritually, communally, and that is not so simple to say. By the way, we know that there was a famous discussion with the chief rabbinate of Israel at the time of the recapture of Jerusalem. Because when Jerusalem was recaptured, and as they say, Har Habayit Biadenu, the chief rabbinate of Israel raised the possibility, famous discussions of Rav Goren, raised the possibility of getting rid of, they were not getting rid of Tisha B'Av, but getting rid of the special prayer talking about the sadness over the destruction of Jerusalem. And they said, we can't say that Jerusalem is now destroyed and desolate. It's not desolate. It has a beautiful light rail. It has great tourism. It has wonderful infrastructure. It's not desolate. And interestingly, that position over the years was, even those who held that position reversed it. Because while we have tremendous gains, especially in terms of our access and our abilities in Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael, there is still a ways to go for Jewish history to be considered at its, at its conclusion. And there are still difficulties and still challenges. Because of those still challenges, we're not in a position right now to erase anything out of the Siddur. But the question, so that was part of the background here. But the question is, should we, recognize the sadness if we think that some of that sadness has subsided? And the answer is absolutely and clearly that we must. That we must remember all those who were lost. We must remember all those who had difficulty, who had pain, who had sadness. And we can't think that we can go forward by just erasing or ignoring those events of the past, especially not celebrating on days of times of destruction. So perhaps that may inform our original question. By the way, I'm happy to hear if you have thoughts about, what the right response would have been to somebody having a Tisha B'Av disco. Maybe, maybe the arguments, you could say, for different communities, they thought they had merit. Generally, I would say that that's, I think, not the approach that we take. And in fact, today is a day of complete sadness. As they say, the currency is one of tears. We spend 3 weeks and then 9 days building up that sense of desolation and loss over the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. What's interesting is that Tisha B'Av, maybe because of this idea about the importance of commemorating and recognizing through all contexts the gravity of Tisha B'Av may actually answer our question. Look at this very unusual Gemara, passage of the Talmud in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. The Talmud says the following. Amar Rav Chana bar Bizna said, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida. There is a famous pasuk in Zechariah, in the book of Zechariah, that says, Ko Amar Hashem Tzvakot, Tzom HaRvi'i, Tzom HaChamishi, V'Tzom HaShvi'i, V'Tzom HaSiri, Yiyeh LeBeit Yehuda, L'Sason U'Lesimcha. Listen to what the Talmud is saying. The Talmud is saying that certain of the fast days of the Jewish calendar will be transformed to days of sason v'simcha, of rejoicing and happiness. Tzom HaRvi'i, Tzom HaChamishi, Shavasar B'Tammuz, it's referring to Asar B'Tevet, Tzom HaShvi'i, Tzom Gedalia. All of these fast days will be turned into days of happiness and rejoicing. Now, I just thought does that mean that the Talmud is endorsing the Asar B'Tevet disco, the Tisha B'Av disco? But look at what it concludes. Says the Gemara, Yachi Tisha B'Av Nami, Amar Papa Shani Tishbav, Hoel V'Huch Pelu Bo Tzarot. Damar Mar, B'Tisha B'Av Charav B'Habayit Rishona, B'Shniya, V'Nukada Beitar, V'Nechar Sha'ir. That Tisha B'Av is either quantitatively or qualitatively so much worse that it will always be a day of sadness and recognition of Jewish suffering. In fact, look at the Torah. The Torah says, Tisha B'Av ein beit yicholim levatlo. Tisha B'Av is so serious, so sad, that it can never be annulled because of all of the terrible tragedies that happen on it. So what is this passage in the Talmud saying? The Gemara seems to be saying, the Torah is quoting it, that Tisha B'Av seems to be fundamentally different than the other fast days. The other fast days are commemorations that we are able to essentially change and change them into days of rejoicing and happiness, as opposed to Tisha B'Av, where we can't. Tisha B'Av, we can never, we can't undo Tisha B'Av because of all of the gravity of all the sadness that happened on that day. And by the way, look, this actually was not a abstract thing. Talmud Bavli Masechet Megillah says, Bikesh Rabbi Bikesh La'akor Tisha B'Av. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the famous author and compiler of the Mishnah, desired to uproot and undo Tisha B'Av. V'lahodulo, but he was not successful. Now, some of the explanation is, why did he want to uproot Tisha B'Av? Because he felt that he felt that it was permitted in certain circumstances to still bring sacrifices, even if there's no Beit HaMikdash. But the idea here is that somehow history has kept Tisha B'Av in a special category. Rabbi Vital Zolti in the book Mishnah Yavetz basically brings all what we're saying together. And he suggests that what is it that the discussion here is about? Can you cancel Tisha B'Av? Should you cancel the other days? Or should you have a celebration? Could you ever have a celebration or not? So Rabbi Vital Zolti says that Tisha B'Av actually has two characters. It's a day of fasting, and it's a day of mourning. The fasting is a fasting which is the concept of a prayer, right? When we're times of difficulty and times of sadness, we turn to God and pray. And part of the way in which we, sort of help our focus and help our essence of tefillah is through fasting. It's also a day of avelut. It's also a day of mourning. The other fast days, by the way, are not days of mourning in the same way, right? Because on the other fast days, you don't sit on the floor. You don't, read books of lamentation. On the other fast days, you generally don't have them for 25 hours. They don't have the same restrictions. They're simply days of prayer. So since they're days of prayer, therefore, you can actually say, okay, we can change how we pray. And instead of praying with a sort of a downward attitude, we can pray with a positive attitude of hope. And that's why we can say those days can be sason v'simcha. Interestingly, the Rambam actually writes that that's the purpose of fasting. The purpose of fasting is to hone our ability to pray and to open ourselves up to God. And then in the Mishnah Masechet Ta'anit talks about how fast days are meant to be this kind of days of commemoration. But that's what a fast day is. A fast day is a day of, not commemoration, but a day of prayer, a day of focusing ourselves. And by the way, fasting in the context of prayer actually could feed into a sense of joy. We have an example where we fast in order to pray, and then we come to a time of great joy. Purim. What happened in Purim? Right, there was a fast back then in the Purim story. It was a 3-day fast in order to pray that God should deliver us. And when that deliverance came, right, the miracle of Purim, then Purim is our day of rejoicing. And every year we have the difficulty of the fasting of Tanit Esther. And then we go straight into the exultation, the excitement, the hope of Purim. So we do have this concept that you have a fast day, and the fast day is a day in which we pray, in which we open our hearts because of all the difficulties and challenges. And the Talmud is giving us hope that one day those difficulties and challenges will subside. But Tisha B'Av has an added context to it, an added idea, which is it's also a day of sadness, a day of mourning, a day of avelut. And avelut, mourning, and ta'anit, fasting, are two separate things. And so let's say somebody's sick on Tisha B'Av. If somebody is sick on Tisha B'Av, or in some sort of medical necessity to eat or drink, what does that mean? It means we pull away the fast day, because they can't fast, and we're left with the day of Avelut, the day of commemoration of the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, if we're commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem, it would make sense to apply that same discussion we had, which is that we should have a benching and have a commemoration and have the special, aspect of Nachem to remind ourselves that today is still Tisha B'Av. And the values that we're supposed to try to do are commemorate the loss of Yerushalayim. So yes, we, for this person, don't have the obligation to fast, and explain why that was, but they're still left with today being a Tisha B'Av, today being a unique day that is there to showcase the commemoration of Yerushalayim. And so the suggestion, therefore, is that, again, we saw that there's others who disagree, but if you need to eat on Yom Kippur and you make a bracha, you should include Nachem, you should include the prayer of the commemoration of Yerushalayim. But this actually leads to a broader question, which I want to spend a couple of minutes delving into, which is there's a fundamental issue here that goes even deeper than what we've been talking about. We've been talking about if you have to eat, should you make a bracha, should you, but what really is going on here is the question of how important is it to try and create an aura of sadness. Now, let me explain. There's a famous song. It's not clear exactly where it starts from. Mitzvah gedola liot besimcha tamid. It's a great mitzvah to always be happy. And in fact, we find great health benefits to raising and having high spirits. Someone's attitude when you try and you figure out a way to make them happy, that also has significant benefits to their overall health. And so much of what we try to do is engender happiness. Think about a holiday. What are we commanded? V'samachta, song. V'samachta b'chagecha, right? V'samachta b'chagecha. Do whatever it takes to create that aura of happiness. La'ihudim hayta ora v'simcha v'sason v'ikar. Do whatever you can to make life as joyous as possible. That is a deeply held Jewish value in the context that of Yom Tov, in the context of Purim, that overall we're meant to look at the world with, rose-colored glasses, or at least a positive attitude, a sense of hope, a sense of, that there is good and there can be good and it will be good. And that, by the way, Gam ki elech begates almavet lo ira ra ki atayim adi, the most famous pasuk in the 23rd chapter of Tehillim. Even when we walk in that valley of the shadow of death, we look upwards and we smile. Ki atayim adi, because we still feel God, even in the afilu b'hastara, even in the times of difficulties and tragedy and God's face being hidden. That we see that God is there with us too, and we do whatever we can to think positively. And that is, again, not only an important psychological concept, it's an important Jewish concept. And here, Tisha B'Av, and by the way, every other fast day, that's what the Talmud had said. In every other fast day, we say, it's all, right? The Pasuk in Zechariah, Yeh lebeit Yehuda l'sason u'lesimcha. We're going to try and have, as much as we can, a time of joy and happiness. Joy and happiness, and trying to create joy and happiness, is a fundamental Jewish value, and we try to do it as much as we can. Right? Interestingly, the concept of nichum avelim. The concept of nichum avelim is that somebody is sit in a place of mourning, and their whole community does whatever they can in order to ostensibly remove that cloud of sadness, cheer them up, look at the look at things in a positive way. So simcha, the concept of happiness, the concept of joy, seems to be such an inherent value. And yet what we're trying to show here is that sometimes there is an importance of trying to not necessarily push happiness, trying to have a different view, trying to, the Pasuk in Eicha says, Kir'ula mekonenot, to try and induce tears, induce wailing. Even at the time where somebody is ill and they have to eat, they still ask for nechama. They ask for consolation. And why? Why is it important to sometimes take a break, so to speak, from our general philosophy of, I don't know about don't worry, but definitely be happy? And I think the answer is, and this I think is what underlies these halachot in terms of Tisha B'Av, the answer is that there's actually two kinds of happiness. There is one kind of happiness that is what I call whitewash. You whitewash the sadness. You take a brush and erase all of the difficulty, erase all of the negativity. Now that's often very, very powerful. And it's, I would almost say, sometimes necessary, the right thing to do. That, by the way, is generally what we say in terms of the aspect of Yom Tov. That's the simcha of Yom Tov. The simcha of Yom Tov is that we force a smile onto our face, right? No matter what's going on. And therefore, if someone is in mourning when it comes to Yom Tov, Yom Tov cancels Shiva. Because those two ideas are incompatible. You're trying to be happy, and you're trying to, that's not compatible to the loneliness and the sadness of Shiva, and therefore Shiva is canceled. But there is a different kind of happiness. You see, the happiness of Sukkot is meant to be, or the happiness of a Yom Tov is meant to be when you basically say, all's right with the world, and you focus on the good, and you focus on the happy, and that's absolutely valuable and important and necessary. There's another kind of happiness where I say where it all isn't right with the world, but you refuse to be brought down by that. You feel like you're deep in the tunnel, but you refuse to lose sight of the light at the end of the tunnel. And I would argue that that is part of the mandate, what we have. Because this second part kind of happiness does not whitewash the struggle, does not ignore the difficulty, looks the challenge, looks the difficulty right in the eye, and says, I know you're here. I know things aren't easy. I know there is sadness. I know there's tragedy. I'm going to read Eicha. I'm going to read the keynote, the sad elegies of all the people who were destroyed and lost. I dare not forget them for their sake and for mine. But what I do is I integrate that difficulty and sadness, and I use it to make the happiness that much sweeter when that time comes, and to use it to have that sense of realism. That, by the way, is the entire notion of Pesach. Pesach could look very different. Pesach could look just like a day of Hallel, right? A day of, Hodul Hashem ki tov ki l'olam chasto. But we don't say that on Pesach. What do we say on Pesach? Avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim. We recognize the challenge. We recognize the difficulty. And then we say, V'achshav kirbanu hamakom la'avodato. And when the scope of the challenge is hochpolo botzarot, is so massive, so we recognize that, and we don't whitewash it. And by the way, that is the nature of what we say in Nachem. Listen to the words of Nachem, and I'll have them here. Let's see if I have them here. Just here. South Africa. But the words of Nachem talk about God, please console us. Now, when you were meant to console someone, right? What exactly does that mean? When you console someone, do you generally, when you make a shiva call or you go to call a friend who is had, do you tell them that it's not really that bad? You don't. When you tell them, oh, it's it's fine, it's not that big of a deal, the trouble or the deal that you're dealing with. That's not the right approach to offer someone, to walk into someone. You just say, It's not such a big deal that this terrible thing or this difficult thing happened. What you say is, I want to recognize, not ignore the challenge of what you're going through, but recognize it and assist you to somehow build yourself up and not be, lost within the context of this difficulty and this tragedy. That's what we say in Achem. That's what we say, Hamakom Yinachem Eschem B'soch She'avei Lutzin Yerushalayim, that you should be consoled. Consolation is not ignorance or ignoring of the difficulty. Consolation is giving that person a broader perspective, right? That's what we learned in the Parshat, in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, where God says that he did not want to take the Jewish people by way of a potential battlefield where they may have to fight a war after they left Egypt. That maybe the people will be, with the word nechama, or nichamti ki asitim. There it doesn't mean they'll be cheered up. It means that they will change their perspective. So that's the concept of nechama. That's what we're asking for on Tisha B'Av. What happens immediately after Tisha B'Av? Shabbat Nachamu. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami Amar Elokechem. It's the Shabbat of consolation. And right after that, the 15th of Av is one of the happiest days where we focus on rebuilding. The 15th of Av, and by the way, in Yom Kippur also, the Mishnah says the 15th of Av, just barely a couple days after Tisha B'Av, was the day of matchmaking, where all the girls would go out and wear a borrowed white dress, and there would be all sorts of dating and matchmaking to try and, have a sense of building, of positivity. Yes, we don't lose our positive attitude. That is an absolutely point of our heritage. But we also don't have a Tisha B'Av disco. We make sure we build from difficulty, but we don't ignore that difficulty exists. And I would add that perhaps that goes back to the answer to our original question, right? If somebody is ill on Tisha B'Av. So the first thing that we saw, both about Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, is how important it is that they take care of their health. Why? Because not, of course, that enduring value of Pikuach Nefesh, that they must take care of their health, but it's because that's exactly the message of the day. The message of the day is we have had things that have been sorely broken in our history, but we are not a broken people. So a person who would not take care of their health, that would be the opposite of what they should do, because they are not, they're taking that approach of being overwhelmed by the sadness. That's what we don't believe in. So they should eat, but they should also commemorate, according to the second approach. Again, we saw the Shabbat Lalaka disagreed. They should eat and remember, because you've peeled away the fast, but still today is a day of commemoration of Yerushalayim, and remember Yerushalayim. At the same time, your Tisha B'Av is different because you are commemorating Yerushalayim by making sure that you stay strong and do not give in to the despair, but build yourself for a future. Build towards that Shabbat Nachamu. And so I would say, just to pull all this together, I would say there's a very powerful inspiration through halacha. The inspiration here is that these halachot, these requirements that you must eat if medically you are required to do so, and you treat that eating not as something that is a detracting or a decrement of taking away from your observance of the day, but both on Yom Kippur, again, this is according to these opinions, both on Yom Kippur and perhaps Tisha B'Av as well, this is your way of commemorating the day. Why? Because we believe in having this positive attitude, this attitude of rebuilding, this attitude of not giving up, right? We learned a couple of weeks ago. Never think that all is lost, but make sure that when you look towards that hope and that positivity, you don't look at it with an ignorance of all the sacrifices and the difficulties that took to get there. And therefore, we must continue to cry and to mourn on Tisha B'Av, because that is a fundamental component of our broader worldview. And we hope that there will be a time that we will have the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, and a time where we can all get together, both safely, but also that we can look for a time where all these things will all come together, and then be able to have a true, broader celebration in the context of the entire tapestry of Jewish history that we'll hopefully all be able to celebrate together. So with that, I wish everybody a nechama on the course of these 9 days, strength and inspiration through all of these things. Also, next week, we will not have a class. So we're going to reconvene in 2 weeks from today, hopefully at a time where we'll all have nechama, we'll all have a consolation. Okay, I'm going to